There's this idea that the government will end up conceding to pressure to have a referendum, which frankly, I think is nonsense, because no government wants to be the government that lost the United Kingdom. So the idea that they're going to grant a referendum that they would lose because refusing a referendum would be not a good look, I think is sort of extraordinarily naive.
Hello, today I'm talking to Henry Hill, news editor of ConservativeHome, regular contributor to CapX, the Daily Telegraph, UnHerd and many other publications, and a frequent commentator on radio and TV for the BBC and other outlets. Good to talk to you, Henry.
Hi, good to talk to you too.
Now, the Union of the United Kingdom is a popular topic among a segment of the British commentariat. A lot of the coverage is deeply pessimistic. The UK is going to break up, Scotland will leave, we're in a state of decline, etc. But you have written a lot about the Union from a Unionist perspective, outlining different positive arguments that I don't think we hear enough. I'd like to start by setting out some context and defining a few terms, if that's okay.
Sure, go ahead.
Firstly, just a small, simple question, easy enough to get us started. What is the United Kingdom? Is it a unitary country, a voluntary union composed of 4 smaller separate nations, a single country, Great Britain, with a province, Northern Ireland, or is it all of the above?
Yeah, so I think this is one of the problems that you often run into in unionist politics and journalism, which is that an awful lot of people are just talking past each other. You can really sort of separate that group of questions into 2 questions. One is, what is the United Kingdom legally? And then the other is sort of a weird kind of Calvin ball game that people end up playing over terms. So legally speaking, the United Kingdom is a unitary state. It has been a unitary state since it was founded. It was an incorporative union. That means that when it was founded first in 1707 with the union between England and Scotland, they didn't keep separate legislatures. They merged and there was the Parliament of Great Britain. Now, there were provisions in the Act of Union for keeping some separate Scottish institutions. There was Scottish law, the Kirk, and some religious autonomy, but it's not a federation. It's not. There's no even theoretical level on which sovereignty, which is ultimately where the final source of power, rests with Scotland and England. It became a single entity called Great Britain. Likewise, in 1800, when Ireland acceded to the Union, the same thing happened again. The Parliament of Ireland was dissolved. Irish MPs sat in the Parliament of the United Kingdom, and the United Kingdom remained the sovereign entity. Now, you can get into lots of definitional disputes about this, because there are people who argue that it's not unitary because not all bits of the United Kingdom are the same. I'd argue that that means it's simply not a uniform state, which is not the same thing as not being unitary. But legally speaking, the UK is a unitary state. The row over what constitutes a country is one of the most frustrating in the whole thing for me, because country is legally meaningless. It's not a word that means anything in law. It has no objective meaning, and so it's basically down to personal preference. Are Wales and Scotland and England countries? I'd say yes. Is the United Kingdom also a country? I'd say yes. That doesn't really tell us anything other than the fact that country is quite an imprecise term to use, and you get these definitional disputes all over the place. Is Wales a principality or not? Welsh nationalists get quite upset about using principality. Personally, I think it's fine. Likewise, I often refer to Northern Ireland as Ulster, a tradition which has quite a long history, but there are Irish nationalists who say actually Ulster has 9 counties, 3 of which are in the Republic. So you can play those language games all day. It's one of the reasons that it can be such a confusing debate for people who aren't deeply involved in it already.
Devolution. What exactly is devolution? When did it start? Why? And how do you think it's going?
So devolution, again, this is a term where the waters have been muddied slightly, because devolution is used to refer to 2 quite different phenomena. The first is legislative devolution to Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, which is where those countries get their own lawmaking bodies. They get their own elected institutions which can pass their own laws. It's also now being used to refer to devolution in England, and that refers to metro mayors, Boris Johnson's proposals for county sheriffs. And the crucial thing about this is that really that's local government, because Andy Burnham and Andy Street and all the rest of it, they can't pass laws. So there's a fundamental qualitative difference between that, which quite a few people in government don't really like calling devolution and actual devolution. So if we confine, for the purposes of defining terms, if we confine devolution to legislative devolution to Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, it was originally imposed on Northern Ireland by Lloyd George in 1922 with the creation of the Parliament of Northern Ireland. I think that was the date. And basically the plan there was that Lloyd George wanted to get Ireland out of British politics. He'd originally hoped to force all of Ireland into a home rule arrangement together. That didn't work because the Unionists in Northern Ireland resisted it so strongly that he ended up having to back down. So the creation of the Parliament of Northern Ireland was all about making it so that British governments and British MPs didn't have to keep thinking about Ireland. And it went, bluntly, it went very badly. It created this strange Protestant-dominated polity that was technically part of the United Kingdom, but was basically running its own affairs and running them quite badly. Sir Edward Carson, the great leader of Irish Unionism, warned that that was exactly what would happen. That collapsed in 1972, and there was a period of direct rule. And then devolution to Northern Ireland was brought back as part of the Belfast Agreement. And then a very different devolved settlement was created for Scotland and Wales by the new Labour government. So I think we should just treat them separately very quickly. Devolution in Northern Ireland is a power sharing arrangement wherein basically every single party that wants to can form a government and is entitled to a place in the government. It's intended to make sure that you don't end up with one half of the country running the province without reference to the other half. That we can go into that if you want to, but it's a completely different kettle of fish. Scotland and Wales have much more normal arrangements. They basically have legislatures that are elected under PR, which have greater or lesser extent of independent lawmaking power. I think in both cases, this is sort of what I'm known for in unionist writing, I think devolution has been a very ill-conceived project and is going very badly, and you're free to probe me on that, but I think definitionally that's probably what your watchers need to know.
Now, finally, final definition. You touched on it briefly there, but unionism. Is unionism simply the ideology, the belief that the United Kingdom should stay as one, or is there more depth to it than that?
So this is actually a problem that I have with unionism, and that I've written about before, which is I think unionism has for too long effectively defined itself negatively. Unionists know what they don't want, and that's independence. But there's not been much work put into a positive idea of what unionists actually do want. You know, why are we unionists? What do we want the union to do? And so therefore we've ended up in a position wherein any proposal that doesn't involve the technical dissolution of the UK is treated as a unionist proposal. And you'll see this when you see commentators coming out and saying, oh well, the United Kingdom should only handle foreign affairs and defence, and we should bring an end to fiscal transfers and give Scotland and Wales full fiscal autonomy and all the rest of it. And that, if carried out, would leave a United Kingdom that basically didn't really do anything. And I think it's quite hard to justify being a unionist on that basis. How to unpack unionism concisely. Unionism broadly refers to anyone who believes that the United Kingdom is better off staying one country. It contains both people who fundamentally don't consider themselves British but have a so-called utilitarian arrangement to the United Kingdom. So they're Scottish or Welsh or English or whatever, but they think that being part of the United Kingdom is better on a practical basis. And it also contains people like me who consider themselves to be British, who consider Britain to be their national state, and who therefore support the United Kingdom on more existential lines. A lot of people don't like the word unionist because it is associated with the troubles in Northern Ireland and a particularly kind of Protestant-flavoured, orange-flavoured perception of unionism from that province. Personally, my family is Irish Catholic, and I have no problem using the word unionist. But you know, other people prefer the pro-union, pro-UK, anti-nationalist, I think is also one. But yeah, so broadly speaking, a unionist is someone who wants the union to stay together, but that term covers an awful lot of differences about what that entails.
For the rest of our conversation, I'd like to do a tour of the UK, starting with Scotland. Now, the May 2021 bumper set of elections included the Scottish Parliament elections, where the Scottish National Party, whose primary political purpose is Scottish independence, fell one seat short of an overall majority. What is the overall state of Scottish politics, and is independence just inevitable?
So no, independence isn't inevitable, and I think that actually unionists are way too pessimistic. It's a real vice, actually, of unionists that they're constantly sort of moping around that the tide of history is against them. I live blogged the 2 days of the Scottish election coverage for ConservativeHome, and it took years off my life because really an awful lot hinged on whether or not Nicola Sturgeon got her majority. She does have a functioning majority because the pro-independence Green Party tend to support the Scottish government on pretty much every vote in the Scottish Parliament, but nonetheless, polling suggested that there was a big difference in public perception and public support for a second independence referendum if Nicola Sturgeon got her majority. In fact, actually, I think Scottish politics is in a really strange place because independence is not imminent. The Scottish government didn't win an overall majority, and actually, I think they might secretly be quietly pleased about that. If you look at the work that's being done on making a credible sort of economic case for independence, it's nowhere. There simply is not a credible economic case, and they haven't made one. The headlines today are full of stories that the SNP are being investigated because hundreds of thousands of pounds that they allegedly raised specifically to fight an independence referendum campaign have apparently been spent. Now, that doesn't suggest that the party thinks that an independence referendum is likely. And personally, and I was a bit of a heretic on this at the time, but I voted for Brexit in large part because I thought it would make Scottish independence harder. The longer we leave it after leaving the European Union, the more divergence there will be between the UK and the European Union. And the SNP's great vision and their vehicle, independence in Europe, becomes harder and harder to achieve. So actually, in the short to medium term, at least, who knows what the future holds, I'm actually pretty optimistic about keeping the union together. But on the flip side, the SNP's position in Scottish politics seems at the moment almost unchallengeable. It's a bit like the Conservative government in England. It doesn't seem to matter how many scandals there are and how many things they get wrong. A substantial plurality of Scottish voters are still just voting for the SNP and look set to continue voting for the SNP. Now, I don't think that's great for Scottish politics. So, but that doesn't necessarily mean that won't happen. So my suspicion is that what will happen is that we may end up with this kind of unfortunate situation where Scotland has this dominant, quite sort of machine party, which nominally espouses nationalism, but mostly just exercises power, likes blaming Westminster, doesn't govern particularly well, but continues to command broad support for essentially identitarian reasons. It might be that when Nicola Sturgeon finally steps down, that starts to change because she has an extraordinarily powerful hold on Scottish voters, which I don't think her successor will be able to easily replicate. But for the moment, I think that we'll end up in a weird position where the SNP are the dominant Scottish party and independence is not going to happen.
It's an existential question, as you mentioned earlier, for the state of the United Kingdom as a country. And so I've kind of gamed it out and thought about potential hypothetical scenarios. So just let me know what you think about this possible future timeline, which I think is fairly reasonable in relation to Scottish independence. So Nicola Sturgeon wants to introduce legislation for a referendum by the end of 2023, and the next UK general election should be in 2024. So there is not likely to be a referendum before the next UK general election, which is in a few years' time. At that election, the Tories will be aware that that's the position that they're in. So they'll likely have a beefed up kind of unionist anti-referendum manifesto. And considering the state they're in at the moment with a massive majority, I do not believe that they will not have a majority at the next election. It might go up or it might go slightly down, but I'm pretty sure that they will be in majority government at the next UK general election. So Boris will then claim to have a stronger mandate based on a more unionist manifesto than Nicola Sturgeon, who will run on the same kind of platform as she always does. But with no way to achieve a referendum, the SNP will become increasingly agitated because the power to call a referendum lies with the Westminster. So Sturgeon will either be ousted by her own party or the SNP will split under the pressure. Without her style power, as you mentioned earlier, support for the SNP and independence will probably fall, and then the party itself will either be kicked out of government or it will just split. Do you think I'm on the right track there?
All of those things are on the cards. I think it would be a very happy day for the union if all of them happened. So to go through it in order, I suspect that the next general election will be in 23. The government's bringing through legislation to repeal the Fixed Term Parliaments Act, which will give it control of the timetable. Will have delivered the boundary reforms by mid-2023, and then I think it will probably I might be wrong, but I suspect it will want to go to the polls a bit earlier so that it can crack on through the mid-20s with the sort of quite painful economic work of rebuilding from COVID and starting to pay off furlough with another election further away. I agree with you that I don't think the government is going to grant a referendum. Now, the government has to be quite careful with how it does this. I personally have written extensively that there is a strong moral case to be made for refusing another Scottish referendum. I mean, your readers or viewers can probably find that, but nonetheless, as far as public messaging is concerned, the government probably shouldn't just be saying no, never. But the government's line on this is actually quite clever. You know, they're saying, right, we're not going to grant a referendum until we have built back from the pandemic. Now, the great thing about that is you can pick almost any metric you like. Is unemployment higher than it was before the pandemic? Oh, well, we haven't built back yet. Is public borrowing higher than it was before the pandemic? And so on and so forth. So you can spin that out for quite a long time. And also, this other idea is that there's this idea that the government will end up conceding to pressure to have a referendum, which frankly, I think is nonsense, because no government wants to be the government that lost the United Kingdom. So the idea that they're going to grant a referendum that they would lose because refusing a referendum would be not a good look, I think is sort of extraordinarily naive. So no, I suspect you're right. I suspect there will not be a referendum. Certainly there won't be a referendum, a legal referendum, before the next the next UK general election. After that, then we start a new game. You know, if you think about the time that it took to negotiate the referendum last time, that was a good couple of years. The SNP won their majority in 2011. We didn't end up having the referendum until 2014. So even if day one a new government, or heaven help us, a government led by Keir Starmer said, right, we're going to grant a Scottish independence referendum, you've then got to negotiate the question, the timing, you know, the lessons we've learned from the EU referendum. I mean, we're not going to give them the question we gave them last time. There'll be disputes over the franchise as well. So then you've got to get the legislation through Parliament, which takes time. And then you've got to have a campaigning period. So assume you have an election in 23, you're looking at a Scottish independence referendum in 2025, if the government went for one immediately, which it won't. And then, yeah, you're right. You know, Nicola Sturgeon at that point has been First Minister for 10 years. How long does anyone stay in a job like that? I mean, Margaret Thatcher did, what, 11? And by the end of it, she was not very popular. You know, the scandals are going to keep mounting. I think it's fair. You know, Nicola Sturgeon, when she initially became First Minister, she was a bit relaxed about, you know, the independence timetable because she had time. Now, she's starting to look a bit more frantic because that time is running out. Nobody's political career lasts forever. But I suspect that we will eventually reach the point where, frankly, she's had enough. She realizes that she's not going to be the woman who delivers independence. She's dealing, as you say, with a party that's increasingly fractious, whose internal discipline is breaking down, and with a governance record which is, frankly, shockingly bad in many important respects. And eventually, if she's not going to be the person who delivers that great prize of independence, she steps aside. Now, whether or not the SNP actually splits or not, I don't know. It has historically had a very strong culture of internal discipline. Alex Salmond is not the man he was, and his attempt to split the SNP flopped quite spectacularly, and I don't see anyone really waiting in the wings to do that again. But, you know, could there be a few more defections to ULPA? Yeah, sure, probably. Could there be public infighting just within the SNP? Yes, there could. I think the question then becomes, you know, how badly do the SNP need to lose for another government in Scotland to be viable? Because if the Labour and the Tories won't talk to each other, which they won't, at least Labour won't talk to the Tories for understandable reasons, then the SNP and the Greens need to do very badly indeed for an alternative government, basically a Liberal Democrat Labour alternative government, to be viable.
Now, Northern Ireland. You were just in Northern Ireland on a trip, which recently, as you mentioned earlier, celebrated its centenary, 100 years since its creation in 1921-22, I believe. What is the political atmosphere like? What's the state of the political scene? And the Northern Ireland Protocol is a hangover from the Brexit deal, and I understand that's causing a lot of tension. What's going on there?
Well, I mean, so Northern Ireland is always, unfortunately, I believe, is a completely separate political system. So for the benefit of viewers who might be less familiar with it, basically, politics in Northern Ireland divides around Unionist, broadly Protestant, pro-UK lines, nationalist, broadly Catholic, pro-Ireland lines. The political system is set up so that parties from both sides have to be in government together. The largest party on each side is the Democratic Unionists for the Unionists, the Sinn Féin, historically linked to the Irish Republican Army for the Nationalists, and then the two more moderate parties, the Ulster Unionists or the UUP and the SDLP, are there as well. And then you've got the Alliance Party, which is kind of like their version of the Liberal Democrats, which is a cross-community party, which sits somewhere in the middle. Politics in Northern Ireland at the moment is fraught, but then again, it normally is. I became Irish correspondent, Northern Ireland correspondent for ConservativeHome, where I currently work, in 2013 when I was studying in Dublin. And Northern Irish politics has been in a state of crisis more often than not for the entire period of time I was there. It is not a well-functioning system of government in general. The two parties, the two main parties, Sinn Féin and DUP, have every incentive to try and keep their bases scared of the other side, to corral them, to keep them in line, no matter how bad the actual outcomes are in terms of governance. It collapsed over welfare reform previously, and as you say, there's now the Northern Ireland Protocol. Now, the Northern Ireland Protocol is, in sum, a rule that's been baked into the Brexit withdrawal agreement, which means that Northern Ireland remains subject to a quite substantial number of EU regulations and faces checks on incoming goods from Great Britain. Basically, in order to get the Brexit deal through, in the peculiar circumstances of the last Parliament, the government signed up to a deal in which Northern Ireland's economic links with the Republic of Ireland and the EU were prioritised over its economic links with mainland Britain. Now, for a unionist like me, that's objectionable on several levels, not least because Northern Ireland's economic links with Great Britain are much more valuable than its links with Ireland and the EU, but also because we're already seeing that the protocol is redirecting trade. So those economic ties which previously helped to bind Northern Ireland to Great Britain are now, if the protocol isn't changed, they're going to flow north-south, and politics follows economics. If we end up with a much more tightly integrated Northern Ireland and Republic of Ireland economy, that will have consequences for the union with Great Britain. But also because for many unionists, it feels like a betrayal, because the Belfast Agreement, which helped to deliver peace in 1998, the great promise of the Belfast Agreement was that Northern Ireland's status as part of the United Kingdom was safe and was guaranteed unless and until a majority of people in Northern Ireland voted to change that in a referendum. Now, what we've seen over the past couple of years is an extraordinarily unbalanced approach to interpreting the Belfast Agreement. So strand 2 of the Belfast Agreement, which covers the north-south dimensions, which is relations between Northern Ireland and the Republic, that has been read extremely expansively. So a quite narrow, any of your viewers who want to look this up, the annex to strand 2 of the Belfast Agreement contains all of the protected areas of the Belfast Agreement, and it's quite short. And yet that annex has been read by implication to mean that actually Northern Ireland is entitled to that Ireland is entitled to an invisible economic border with Northern Ireland. That it is somehow a Belfast Agreement commitment that there can be no border infrastructure of any kind on the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic. Now, that isn't true, but it is the line that Dublin and Brussels came up with and which they sold to London. Now, in and of itself, that is a legitimate school of treaty interpretation. It's not one that I have much time for, but the problem is that you have to contrast this with how the provisions of the Belfast Agreement that favour unionists have been interpreted. So we saw this recently in a court case, which was brought by unionists against the protocol. It said that the protections offered to Northern Ireland's place in the United Kingdom extend only to the fact of Northern Ireland being in the United Kingdom. So to the very top level sovereignty question of, is Northern Ireland on the map? Is Northern Ireland in pink or green? It doesn't apparently extend to anything else. So it doesn't protect Northern Ireland's social, economic and political links with the UK, with the rest of the UK at all. Now, we can see the line of thinking that this has arisen from. Unbelievably, there were people who actually took the government to court during the last Parliament because Theresa May formed an alliance with the DUP MPs in Parliament, and there were people who said that breached the Belfast Agreement because the Belfast Agreement obliges the British government to be neutral. So what we have is a manifestly unjust double standard, wherein unionist protections under the Belfast Agreement are interpreted as narrowly as they can possibly be interpreted, and nationalist entitlements under the same treaty are interpreted as expansively as they can possibly be interpreted. Now, this has obvious consequences for the Belfast Agreement and the system that it underpins, because the whole purpose of that treaty is that it commands the respect of both sides and that it respects both sides. If we start seeing its provisions and being continually reinterpreted and always to the favour of one side and the detriment of the other side, then we're going to start seeing support amongst the people who lose out fall. Now, the Loyalist Communities Council, which is an organisation which represents pro-UK paramilitary groups, has already withdrawn its support from the Belfast Agreement, and I'm worried that if the protocol issue isn't resolved, we may see mainstream unionist parties start going the same way, because, you know, David Trimble, who won the Nobel Peace Prize for the Belfast Agreement, he keeps saying that this isn't what he signed up to. And if people keep saying, well, it might not have been what you signed up to, but it's what we've decided this treaty means and you did sign it, I think they'll be well within their rights to reconsider their support for that whole treaty arrangement.
Now, this brings me to another question on Northern Ireland, which you touched on briefly about North-South relations. There is or at least in a lot of media coverage, it sounds a lot like there is the threat of a border poll, a referendum on unification of Ireland, Northern Ireland, to create a united Ireland. Do you think that is a possibility in the near future? Do opinion pollings tend to bear that out? And on the protocol itself, is there anything that can be done to fix it? Or do you think ultimately it's going to have to be scrapped?
Okay, so we'll take those questions in order. No, I don't think a border poll is imminent. The Secretary of State has discretion over when to hold one. They basically can only grant one when it looks like the nationalists will win it, which is one of the many things which I think is very badly designed about the Belfast Agreement. It's not really a very good peace deal, looking at it with the benefit of 20 years of hindsight. But setting that to one side, you can start to see the problems with a border poll when you look at the way that Irish politicians talk about it. Now, you know, there is one polling company which consistently shows higher levels of support for United Ireland, which is the official lingo, than others. Now, you know, I'm skeptical that that poll is the accurate poll, but let's set that aside for a minute. The question is, not only would Northern Ireland have to vote to leave the UK and join the Republic, but the Republic would have to vote to accept them. That's the two parts of the Belfast Agreement process. Now, it's not obvious at all that voters in the Republic actually want that to happen, or at least want that to happen anytime soon. On the top level, they do. If you go and ask them, do you want a united Ireland? They go, yeah, of course, you know, everyone does. But when you actually start drilling into what that would entail, their stories change. You know, are you prepared to foot the enormous bill that the United Kingdom basically pays out into Northern Ireland every year in the form of the block grant and security spending? No, they're not. The official plan for Irish unity, which was put together by the Irish Parliament, actually said that Britain would just pay that full amount for 20 years. That was the only way they could get it to work. Are they prepared to change the symbols of the state? You know, the tricolour, the Irish flag, in Northern Ireland, that's a divisive symbol of one community. So if they wanted to genuinely create an Irish state that reflected everyone on the island, they'd need a new flag. Are they prepared to do that? I don't think they are. Are they prepared to change any of their constitutional structures? Are they prepared to give an official role to the British character of unionists in the northeast of the island? You know, for example, would they have the Queen as head of state or co-head of state? Would there be an official role for Britain in defending the interests of unionists on the island? Would there be a right for British citizens, for the British community in Ireland to retain eternal access to British citizenship? With the military, with the Irish regiments of the armed forces, to be able to recruit there because they're very big and important to unionists? All of these questions. And the answer is pretty much always no. And I think that's actually perfectly legitimate. If you're a citizen of the Republic of Ireland, you have over the past 100 years built a country with its own identity, a country with its own symbols, its own history, its own institutions, and that's a perfectly legitimate state. And I understand why they would be reluctant to jettison much, or indeed any of that, for the sake of annexing a million angry people who don't want to be part of that country. But I think the problem with that is that if you're not prepared to do any of those things, you do have to ask yourself some fundamental questions about whether or not you should be trying to get those people into your country at all. Now, Leo Varadkar, in a recent speech, he talked a good game about a new Ireland, but it always just tends to be top level stuff about, oh, we'll have a new Ireland, we'll protect their right to have orange marches and the rest of it. And there's no substantive engagement with the very unpopular decisions that an Irish government would have to make. And so personally, I think that no, there's not going to be a border poll anytime soon. With regards to the protocol, personally, I think the protocol needs to go. I think that notwithstanding the ability of the government to ameliorate its practical effects, I think that the principle that it conceded, which I discussed earlier, the idea that Northern Ireland's economic links with the Republic should be prioritised over its links with the mainland, is noxious and false and should be repudiated. And I don't necessarily think that will happen, but that's what I think should happen. With regards to the protocol itself, the government really needs to secure an opt-out or an exemption or something for food supplies, because this is the really totemic issue. You know, it's supermarkets that have British goods on their shelves currently switching to switching to Irish and European goods and that kind of thing, because an awful lot of the trade that's east-west, the east-west trade, this is one of the cases they made when they were justifying a sea border. An awful lot of the east-west trade is big stuff that comes in on ships, and you know, the trade across the land border is much more fiddly. But this is the really emotive stuff. It's people in unionist communities who've seen their position in the United Kingdom as they see it traded away, who then go into their supermarket and they see stuff gone from the shelves. That hits you right in the gut. That hits you on a really visceral level, and that's what's making people angry. Now, I agree with Unionists in Northern Ireland when they say that, look, they were given the same ballot paper as everyone else. The ballot paper, the Brexit ballot paper in 2016 did not say, do you believe that the Great Britain should leave the European Union and leave Northern Ireland behind? It said, do you believe that the United Kingdom should leave the European Union? And there was nothing in there to say that vote wasn't being offered to Northern Irish voters on the same terms as everyone else. But on a practical level, I think the government needs to stick to its guns enough that it becomes obvious that the protocol is not, as the EU claim, defending the peace in Northern Ireland. That's what needs to happen. And I think the government's doing that. The government is being very reasonable. It hasn't triggered Article 16. It's made some targeted interventions on grace periods and so on. But I think the government needs to stick to its guns and say, look, we are not going to allow this situation to arise wherein our goods are shut out of Northern Ireland and Northern Ireland goes to hell because the Loyalists and the Unionists rightly see their position in the UK as being fundamentally compromised. If you are primarily interested in peace, you will talk to us and find a solution. But if you're actually elevating the integrity of the EU single market over the peace, we will expose you for doing that, and then we will take appropriate action to remedy the situation.
Now, Wales. In the same set of 2021 elections that we just mentioned, we had the Welsh Parliament elections, and the Welsh Labour Party won a majority of 30 of the 60 seats and has been in power in some form since the Welsh Parliament was established in 1999. Why is that? How is devolution playing out in Wales? And what is the state of separatism and unionism in the country?
So Wales is actually a really interesting case, because Wales is oddly the bit of the UK with devolution where explicitly anti-devolution sentiment is actually highest. Now, they unfortunately missed out on seats at the election despite having polled very strongly, but it did look at one point as if a party called Abolish the Welsh Assembly was going to enter what is now the Welsh Parliament, and polls suggest that, you know, at least 1 in 10, perhaps more, you know, sometimes 1 in 5 Welsh voters are in favour of scrapping the Senate. Now, that changes the dynamic of Welsh elections quite a lot. The problem, as I see it with Wales, is this. In 1998, Wales actually voted for devolution by a hair's breadth. It was an extraordinarily close race. Wales overwhelmingly rejected devolution in 1979. Why we didn't respect that vote, you know, you tell me. But it voted for devolution by a hair's breadth. But then basically what happened is an awful lot of voters who opposed the existence of the Welsh Assembly just ignored it. Look at the difference in turnout between Westminster elections and Welsh Assembly elections, the Welsh Parliament elections as they are now. Turnout for the Welsh Parliament has yet to top 50%. Turnout for general elections is usually, 20 points higher? And you can see what kind of voters are by the different impact that has on the parties. At Westminster, the Conservatives are comfortably Wales's second party. There's no challenger for that status. They are there, hundreds of thousands of votes ahead of everyone else. In the Assembly elections, they're competing with Plaid. And Plaid sometimes take the second place slot, sometimes they lose it. But the reason for that is that hundreds of thousands of voters who vote Conservative at Westminster, and I'm told by MPs and campaigners at council elections, So these aren't just lazy people who only turn out for generals. These are people who are engaged enough to vote often for local government. They just ignore the assembly. They don't think it has anything to do with them, which is unfortunate because it controls their schools and hospitals and has done a really bad job in both of those areas. So basically, Labour has an advantage in that the electorate for the Welsh Assembly, the de facto electorate, the people who bother to turn out, is small and is therefore very heavily disposed towards being pro-devolution, and which Welsh Labour are. Welsh Labour have also helped to keep what they've done to stop Plaid Cymru doing what the SNP did, is Welsh Labour are now basically the nationalist party in Wales. Mark Drakeford is often trotted out by sort of slightly clueless London media outlets as a pro-UK voice for this or that, but really, like, he's pro. I talked to you about the different sorts of unionism earlier. Mark Drakeford has said that he's not British. He has no loyalty to the idea of Britain at all. He's very much in a what can Wales get out of this mercenary unionism, and I think that that's often missed by people who take his contributions about the future of the UK and present them to the national media. So that's the current situation. The Tories have done all right. They were worried about the rise of abolish the assembly because they thought they basically become a new UKIP. But in the course of, just as Labour have become more nationalist to keep Plaid Cymru down, the way that the Tories ended up helping to stymie the rise of abolish the assembly is they became much more stridently anti-devolution themselves. They ran their election campaign in May on the slogan of "No more powers." There's 2 or 3, I believe, members of the Senate, Conservative members of the Senate, who are in favour of abolishing the Senate. So, and the activist base is overwhelmingly in favour, or at least very strongly in favour of doing that. So in Wales, you've got this very, very interesting tension between Labour have still managed to hold on, which they didn't do in Scotland, but they're increasingly nationalist, and the Tories are much more openly diva-sceptic than they are in Scotland. Now, they are privately, most of them are diva-sceptic in Scotland as well, but they can't say so. So you've got this really fascinating clash on the constitutional question. Unfortunately, whilst that very exciting clash is going on and people like me are writing about it, the Welsh government's handling of schools and hospitals and so on is very bad for the most part, but that tends to be what happens with devolution.
England. The Euros saw a surge of patriotism, English flags, conversations about reclaiming an inclusive English identity, and the country united behind the English football team. Is this, do you think, a temporary phenomenon or a step towards a more comfortable English identity? And following on from that, England is 85% of the UK by population. Could the answer to separatism be to devolve more power within England too, maybe even by establishing an English parliament?
Okay, so there's a lot of questions in there. So let's just try going through them. I've written before. For me as a Brit, I am sad that there is outside the Olympics that there isn't a British sports team for most things. I see the great power that sport has to bring nations together, to make national identities accessible to people who maybe have moved to the country recently or have previously struggled to feel part of it. I've seen people, you see people on Twitter, especially ethnic minority communities who historically have felt much more comfortable being British, because they felt British is an accessible civic identity, whereas English they perceived as a more ethnic national one. And they're saying, yes, the experience of cheering on the England team with everyone else has given me a way into Englishness, and that's great. I don't want anyone to feel excluded from an identity of the place that they live in. If more people feel able to be English as a result of cheering the England team, that's good for them. But I do regret the fact that comes at the expense of having these opportunities for Britain. And we only get the Olympics once every 4 years. It doesn't, for all that it is often very popular, it doesn't have the emotional power of football. Do I think this will lead to English nationalism in a political sense? Currently, no. Simply, there's no vehicle for it. This is one of the reasons that the Conservative Party is the place that you'd find English nationalism, and there is some, but for the most part, the Conservative Party can still win national elections, and a lot of Tories even, you know, Tories whose actual outlook is alienated from Scotland and Wales because of devolution and 20 years of really having nothing to do with them, they still feel British. The Union Jack is still their flag. The outline of the UK and Northern Ireland is still what they think of in their mind when they think of my country. And so, you know, converting national sentiment into a nationalist movement takes foci and opportunities. And whilst the opportunities have sometimes arisen, there hasn't really been the foci, which is why, to answer your last question, an English Parliament would be an absolutely terrible idea, and no unionist should ever do it, ever. There's no historical precedent for a federation working where one part of it is most of it. You know, the Soviet Union is the obvious example. The moment the Soviet Union tried to hold itself together as a post-communist democratic federation, everyone left. I think eventually even Russia left. I think Kazakhstan was technically the last member of the Soviet Union. There's no basis in history for us to think that will work. But more to the point, there's every reason to think that it would do to the Union in England exactly what it's done to the Union in Scotland and Wales. What devolution does is it creates a class of politicians and also researchers, journalists, think tankers, and all the rest of it, who have a direct vested interest in clawing more and more power from Westminster and hollowing the United Kingdom out. That's what's happened. You know, over the last 20 years in Scotland and Wales, we have these permanently established lobbies for more powers, and who also have a strong incentive to occlude and disguise the failures of governance at the devolved level and to shift the blame onto Westminster, which is a corrosive process. And, you know, the same thing actually happened with our membership of the European Union. You know, we had 20 years of politicians blaming Europe for this and that, and shock horror, we ended up leaving the EU. So if we created an English Parliament would do exactly the same thing. It would create this huge class of politicians who'd be effectively anti-Westminster, but they'd be even more dangerous than Scotland and Wales, because at least in Scotland and Wales, even the most sort of shameless divocrat likes the Barnett formula. You know, they accept that their nation is a net recipient of British cash, and therefore they have at least some pecuniary loyalty to the United Kingdom. That wouldn't be the case for an English First Minister. An English First Minister would be able to identify savings. They'd be able to say, look, if we weren't sending all this money to Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, I could spend it buying votes in whichever bit of England didn't vote for them. So the question I always like to put to Unionists is, imagine that our next Boris Johnson, instead of coming up through London, through being Mayor of London, he came up through being First Minister of England. He would probably end up being our Boris Yeltsin. And then and setting aside all of that, there's also the fact simply that, you know, one of the advantages supposedly of devolution to Scotland and Wales is that they're much smaller and they represent distinct electorates with distinct needs. In England, you're not really bringing power closer to the people, are you? You're just hiving off about 15% of the electorate and then giving the rest of them exactly the same form of government they have now. So no, an English Parliament is a terrible idea. More devolution within England, more local government, yes, that's probably the solution. It is right to say that, you know, over the past few decades we have perhaps excessively centralized in some areas, and there is an advantage to having local decision making, maybe even local tax raising powers. Crucially, not local, as I said at the beginning, not the ability to make a completely separate legal system, but the ability to administer and to change tax rates and everything else. Yes, that should be, there's scope for more devolution. But the real promise of that is that actually the government can then use that model and use it in Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland. Because Scotland and Wales especially have been extraordinarily centralising. Each of those governments in Edinburgh and Cardiff is obsessed with making sure that everything is done on a national basis. Everything has to be a Scottish policy or a Welsh policy. Now in Scotland, that means that if you're in Aberdeen, the Northern Isles like Orkney and Shetland, or the Highlands, your specific needs are not reflected in national policy. Instead, the Scottish government has adopted a very successful policy, I have to say, of holding down tax rates, forcing governments to cut their budgets, and then offering ring-fenced central government funding to make up the shortfall, which increases the power of the Scottish government at the expense of local government and allows the Scottish government to take credit for things which local government should be doing. In Wales, you've actually got an even worse problem, because Wales, in many ways, is not a particularly logical unit for human organisation. You know, it's basically a very long country with massive mountains in the middle. South Wales' natural hinterland is Bristol, and North Wales' natural hinterland is Merseyside. But the Welsh government keeps insisting on north-south solutions. So at one point early in the pandemic, people in North Wales had to drive for 4 hours to go to the one testing centre in Cardiff because there was no provision made for them to go to a testing centre in Liverpool. And I've spoken to a lot of North Welsh MPs about this, and this is one of the things that really helped to drive the Conservative breakthrough in North Wales at the 2019 general election, is anger, resentment of the fact that they view Wales as constantly being run according to Cardiff priorities. Now, for me, I think that part of the case for unionism has to be, and this is why I think devolution, the way we've done devolution has been so terrible, this devolve and forget approach, wherein something is either completely devolved or it's not, is that you have to have a union that does things. You have to be able to go to voters and say, actually, the United Kingdom has got your back if the Scottish government or the Welsh government is consistently mismanaging your hospital or your school. You have recourse to the British government. Now, in terms of local government, if we have a successful model for devolution local government within England, that's a template that we can then take to Aberdeen, to Orkney, to Shetland, to North Wales, and Westminster can build direct relationships with those parts of the country and give them strong local institutions that are safeguarded by Westminster and can't be taken away by Cardiff and Edinburgh. And I think that is the real power of a local government-led approach to reforming the United Kingdom, and that we can pilot that in England, and that's the prize.
Well, you have really neatly led me to my final question, the future of the Union. Now, some have argued that, I mean, you've kind of covered this already, but some have argued that radical devolution, more mayors, kind of the localism you were talking about, stronger councils, more local leadership, as Boris Johnson mentioned, could save the Union. Maybe even a federal UK, something you touched on earlier in our conversation, or something that we don't hear discussed about ever. Could we see the opposite? Could we see devolution rolled back? Could we see a new act of union? The British state strengthened with more, as you mentioned, national institutions and national legislation like the UK Internal Market Act. Perhaps the Crown dependencies and British overseas territories drawn closer to the UK, maybe even incorporated into the Union and given parliamentary seats. What do you think is the future of the United Kingdom?
Okay, again, a lot of questions. So if I miss one, do tell me and I will answer it at the end because it won't have been deliberate. Working backwards, the overseas territories model is an interesting question because the way that we've structured the overseas territories means that the United Kingdom is constantly getting harassed and harangued by the United Nations for having colonies, despite the fact that these are mostly tiny islands, and if they wanted to leave, we'd let them leave. The reason we still have Bermuda is because Bermuda overwhelmingly rejected independence, and if ever Bermuda voted for independence, Bermuda would get it. Whilst France, which, as you say, adopted the model, adopted the model of integrating its overseas territories into the French polity, France doesn't get any of that. And France still has a whole country. France has French Guiana. It has a whole bit of, it's not an island, it's a massive bit of land. It has a land border with Brazil. And no one cares. You never hear anyone complaining about this. It's remarkable. It has to be said, most of them don't want to be integrated into the United Kingdom. I don't think. The Crown dependencies certainly don't, because they have a very sweet setup at the minute. They basically get to be tax havens with all the advantages of being British and not having to pay much tax. So that's fine for them. Historically, the Foreign Office has been very averse to integrating the overseas territories for reasons I can't quite work out. I think the strongest case for integration is Gibraltar. Because in the era of devolution, Gibraltar actually wanted this in the past and asked for it. Fabian Picardo, the current First Minister, has spoken warmly about the prospect, and I think in the era of devolution, it would actually be relatively simple to come up with a system that said, right, you can keep your devolved settlement, your internal affairs will still be run by Gibraltarians and the Gibraltarian Parliament. You'll get a seat in the House of Commons, and prior to scrapping English votes for English laws, we could have said you'll only get to vote on matters that affect Gibraltar, and that would have been fine. As it is, they'll get to vote on everything, but as there's only one of them, I think no one would care. And I'm surprised Boris Johnson hasn't looked at this, because everyone talks about Boris Johnson as being the next Lord North if he loses Scotland. If he annexed Gibraltar, then he would be the first Prime Minister since, I think, Pitt the Younger to expand the United Kingdom, which is a quite different place in the history books. On the question of federalism, again, the problem with federalism is that federalism doesn't mean anything, or it means different things to different people. What you tend to find when you get people talking about a federal UK is that they've gone round different constitutions and they've picked the decentralizing bits of half a dozen of them, and they go, well, this works because it happens in Germany, and this works because it happens in America, and so on. and they don't have the balancing that, and these constitutional ideas, they don't reflect the unique circumstances of the United Kingdom, and they also just lack the centripetal countervailing forces that make those constitutions work. You know, Germany and America and Spain and France, secession is illegal. It's constitutionally prohibited. Now, if someone were to come up and say, I believe in a federal United Kingdom, the quid pro quo is you wouldn't be allowed to leave the United Kingdom ever, I'd be much more relaxed about decentralization, because, you know, the main danger would have been taken away. But as it is, they're suggesting taking bits of constitutional law from countries that have that safeguard and are trying to apply it to a country that doesn't have that safeguard. The metaphor I like to use is the difference between, you know, endoskeletal and exoskeletal animals. You know, the beetles and so on, they have a big hard exterior, and therefore they can afford to be quite squishy in the middle. That's a federal constitution with a prohibition on secession. Britain is endoskeletal. You know, the outside is a bit squishy. There's no iron cast defence of the existence of the UK. Therefore, the internal institutions on which it rests need to be stronger. Yeah, and that's Parliament and all the rest of it. So a federal Britain, you know, what does a federal Britain look like? Does it mean Scotland and Wales having a veto on UK level policy, which is often suggested? The English aren't going to wear that. Why would they? You know, we also have to remember that the SNP especially are not good faith partners in the United Kingdom. They don't want Great Britain to work. So if we're saying, okay, we're going to make the operation of the United Kingdom dependent on their say-so, they're going to make the United Kingdom malfunction. And then they'll go to Scottish voters and they'll cite that malfunction as the case for independence. As for radical federalism or radical decentralization, this is, I think, the most interesting one, because I don't think a federal Britain is going to happen. The idea of radical decentralization is basically that you devolve so much power to the devolved assemblies that it basically doesn't become worth it to get rid of the UK. You'll often basically see this being advanced by nationalists trying to offer advice to Unionists. They'll say, you know, what if we restricted the United Kingdom to foreign affairs and defence, maybe tax, and the rest of it was all devolved? And, you know, I think there's two problems with this. The first is, would it work in its own terms? And I don't think it would, because I think the problem with that is, especially if you start reaching the point which some commentators have reached, where you're not distributing money around the UK and you're not doing fiscal transfers, the question becomes, why bother keeping the United Kingdom together? If you are doing fiscal transfers, then the question is, how do you maintain consent for fiscal transfers amongst the bits of the country that are paying in? You know, you can't have a British taxpayer prepared to see their money spent in Scotland and Wales if at the same time you repudiate the idea of Britain as a political decision-making community. If you say it's illegitimate for the British, collectively as the British, to decide to go to war, leave the European Union, without reference to our subdivisions, then I don't think you can really tax the British as the British either. So that's a problem that I think is often not addressed. But the other problem, and this touches right back on what I talked about at the very beginning, is the question of, you know, why are we Unionists? I'm not a Unionist just because I want something called the United Kingdom to exist. I'm not in this fight for the British Isles diplomatic and defence community. I'm British, one, because, or I'm a Unionist, one, because I'm British, and I think that the UK is my national state, and I want to be governed on that basis. You know, I want self-rule too. But second, because I think that it very often actually delivers better outcomes. You look at the story of Welsh education, you look at the story of the Scottish NHS, there is not a compelling case here that devolution, as we've done it over the past 20 years, has actually delivered for people. And I think that the problem for a lot of Unionists is, you know, we talk about how do we win the next referendum, if there is one. And we talk about the need to make a positive emotional case for the United Kingdom, the fact that we can't keep relying on money and headline figures and fiscal transfers. Now, that's entirely true, we can't. Didn't work in the European Union referendum, won't work now. But the problem with that line of thinking is that if you want a case for the United Kingdom that doesn't just rest on money, the United Kingdom needs to do more than give money to Scotland and Wales. You know, this is why I think the United Kingdom Internal Market Act is so important. The fact that the British government can now go and spend additional money on hospitals, on schools, on sport, on cultural programs. Because you need to be able to show that the United Kingdom actually works for the people of Britain in every part of Britain on the issues that they actually care about. Because if you're stuck in, if you're in North Wales, your local NHS trust has been in special measures for 6 years, and your local school's not very good. The Unionist knocks on the door and says, "Hi, can I persuade you to vote for the United Kingdom, please?" And they say, "Well, what can you do about my local hospital?" That's devolved. "What can you do about my local school?" That's devolved. There's no case. You can't build a positive emotional case for a union that doesn't do anything. Now, I don't think we're anywhere near, as you mentioned, getting rid of devolution. I don't think that's on the cards in anything except the very long view. But I think that we need to move away from the explicit assumptions of the Blair era devolution model, that devolution is a one-way street, and that B, we simply devolve whole areas of policy without then having Westminster overseeing the results. I think we need a stronger role for Westminster alongside the devolved administrations. We need Westminster to be mandating the collection of uniform data so that the performance of public services across the United Kingdom can be compared, and the First Ministers of Scotland and Wales can't evade scrutiny, as they have, by changing how data is collected and opting out of international comparisons. We need Westminster to be there to step in if a Welsh hospital is in special measures for 6 years, and so on and so forth. But that's how I think we do it. It's called, somebody referred to it as devolve and compete, which I actually think sounds like quite a good idea. I think that's the future of unionism, if unionism has a future.
Thank you very much. I thought that was fascinating on the future of the UK. And a short final question, just to close. Is the Labour Party a unionist party?
Oh, what a question. Bits of it are, and it depends on what sense you mean. Is Welsh Labour specifically a unionist party? Ish. It likes the money. Is UK Labour a unionist party? Yes, as it applies to the mainland. Is Scottish Labour a unionist party? Yes, currently, but there are people in Scottish Labour who would quite like Scottish Labour to change that view. With regards to Northern Ireland, no. And I think this is a real problem, actually. I've not really touched on it because Northern Ireland is its whole own kettle of fish, but Labour, I think, has consistently failed to live up to the spirit of the Belfast Agreement by refusing to stand in Northern Ireland. In fact, it refused to even let people in Northern Ireland join the Labour Party. They had to take it to court to get the right to join the Labour Party, and it refuses to stand there. And that's a real problem, I think, because one, I think that voters in every part of the United Kingdom deserve the right to vote for a party of government or not vote for it if they don't want to. The Conservatives stand, and the Conservatives don't do very well. That doesn't really matter for this purpose. I think that every voter in the UK should get to cast their vote for or against both the parties that are going to form a government under our current system. And I think Labour lets down Northern Ireland by not letting that happen. But it's also because Northern Ireland deserves a pro-UK, non-sectarian progressive party. At the moment, Labour officially has a sister party relationship with the SDLP, who are nationalists and want to break up the UK. They don't appeal to pro-UK voters. And the only other left-wing pro-UK party is the Progressive Unionist Party, which has official links to loyalist terrorist groups. So, right-thinking voters won't vote for them either. So I think that actually the Labour Party could fill a really valuable niche in Northern Irish politics if it consented to stand. And I think that if it wanted to live up to its rhetoric about respecting Northern Ireland's place in the United Kingdom, it should stand. But at the moment it doesn't. And so in that respect, at least, it's not a unionist party, and that is to Labour's great discredit.
Henry Hill, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Cheers. Great to talk to you.